Hi, good evening, and welcome to the Graduate School of Architecture Practice Lecture Series. My name is Mark Raymond, and I'm the Director of the Graduate School of Architecture. And we have the great pleasure this evening of introducing Nabeel Essa, who will be talking about his practice with us as part of our series. Uh, it's part of an ongoing series that we've been running for the last few years. This is the second lecture of the series. Next week, we'll be featuring some recent GSA graduates talking about their current forms of practice and their aspirations for their practice, which we're excited about. And they're also going to be having some of their work exhibited in the second part of our emergent practice exhibition at the Goethe Institute. And you'll be able to find more information about that online through our social media channels. But this evening, we will be having Nabeel Essa talk about his practice. But before I introduce him, just a few protocols to observe during the course of the meeting. First of all, I can see that a couple of you still have your cameras on. If I can ask you to turn your camera off, so that the screen that we're seeing is the speaker and people are not distracted. So as I said, a number of you still have your cameras on. If I can ask you just to turn your cameras off and to turn your mics off. If you could oblige, we would be grateful. Thank you. For those of you who want to get CPD points for this is a CPD accredited event. After the talk, in the chat, we'll provide you with details as to how you can apply for the necessary points and credits that you'll have earned for attending the lecture. And also importantly, if you have any thoughts, any reflections, any questions that you can think of that you would like to pose to Nabeel, having heard his talk, please feel free to put them in the chat during the course of the lecture, the presentation. And at the end of it, I'll moderate the questions with Nabeel. You can also put your hand up at the end, and you'll have the mic, and you can pose the questions directly to Nabeel. Through these series, that's a really interesting moment, I think. Of course, we're all here to hear about Nabeel's practice and to the stories behind the projects. But it's really also a really good opportunity for you to ask him questions about his practice or anything that might have come up during the course of the lecture. It's a really good opportunity for exchange and insight, to get greater insight into the work that's being presented. So let's move to an introduction to Nabeel. I met Nabeel when I first visited the GSA in 2018 for the Architecture Week, and I've been really interested and curious about his work. I've seen glimpses of it in various places. He's also somebody that's been really active at the GSA as a regular visiting critic for the school, providing his experience and insight in reviewing the work of students. He's a practicing architect who's based in Johannesburg, has a practice in fine arts. He graduated with a Bachelor of Architecture with distinction from Wits, and also spent some time in the Landscape Architecture unit at the Architectural Association, where he studied at a master's level, got a master's degree there. Landscape Urbanism at the Architectural Association in London. He teaches currently as a part-time lecturer at Wits and has experience not only of Wits at the GSA, but all over South Africa. He is the founder of the interdisciplinary practice Office 24/7 Architecture. And he says the nature of the practice reflects an alternative viewpoint, one of embodied experience, of difference and otherness that is framed from the vantage of the margin. It's a space of praxis where ideas are explored and executed. So for those of you who are familiar with the Graduate School of Architecture, you'll understand that type of practitioner is a practitioner that's one that's of great interest to us, what we would call a critical practice, and somebody who we remain very close to and have a lot to learn from, and it's a very welcome part of our community. Recently, Nabeel exhibited at the Venice Biennale, curated by Leslie Locker, the Architectural Biennale last year, and I'm sure he's going to share his work in that exhibition with us this evening, and the story behind that work. But he was also a collaborator with this year's South Africa Pavilion at the Art Biennale, Quiet Ground, piece of work curated by Portia Manache and undertaken by the artist Made You Look. And Nabeel is also going to be sharing some of that work. So I think it's this intersection that Nabeel has with museography, with the art world, as well as practicing sometimes in a more orthodox way as an architect, that make his practice really distinctive. So I'm going to hand over to Nabeel now to introduce himself and to make a presentation of his practice. And as a reminder, these lectures allow us insight into the work that the practices produce, the product. That's the conventional way in which architects present their work. But we prompt all the presenters at the practice lectures to give us a look inside the practice, to let us have an understanding of where did the practice come from, how did it evolve, how does it work, how does it operate? These are the things that interest us. And I know that I've had a little glimpse of what Nabeel is going to share with us this evening, and I think we're all in for a really fascinating and stimulating evening. So thank you, Nabeel. Over to you.
Mark, thank you very much for that lovely intro. I had a long-standing relationship with GSA because there is this fit, and as you mentioned, but thank you for inviting me. It's the first time I'm actually speaking publicly. I've been a critic here since sort of inception of the GSA, so for many years. And thank you for that beautiful graphic by Fred Swart. It's just a kick to have a poster by him. So today, Mark's asked me to sort of talk about the founding of the practice, and I want to be quite honest about the founding of it, and what it takes to become an architect, and what it takes to become kind of a different architect is the way I would see myself, and what it takes to form a practice, or what it has for me. Not to say that this is a model or a successful one. It is just the truth of what my practice is. And I start going far back. In fact, I'll go further back than this. But I think of myself as an 8-year-old in a small town going to a matinee on a Saturday. So I lived in an Indian township where, with friends, we could walk to the cinema, and we would go to the cinema and watch things like Bruce Lee. And it was in this kind of cinema that was two-tiered. And it may seem very ordinary to you, but it was my first understanding of space, and I wasn't aware of it at that time, but it was an understanding of segregated space. So people of color were entered through the back and went up the staircase and sat in the upper tier, while white patrons sat downstairs. And so when I talk embodied, I mean that I've been through this kind of apartheid segregation and also post-apartheid sort of dismantling of these structures. And so my practice and my being is very much related to those kind of experiences that shift between this boundary of shifting, of change, and between sort of governmental kind of institutions or segregated institutions to more privileged spaces, and so I oscillate between these two things. And the images I'm showing now, the top one would be the school I went to, primary school, which would have been a Indian government primary school in apartheid South Africa, and then my last 3 years of education or schooling education was at a very interesting private school. And I show an image of it to show you the spatialities of it and how these things start to form who you are as an architect and your spatial sensibilities. And so I have the kind of like very basic, lovely government school and this sort of architect designed school that was on the river, and that not just the architecture, but the entire idiom, the entire ethos of the school was about non-racialism. It was a non-racial school in apartheid times, and it was a school that didn't have uniforms. It was an experimental school. It was non-denominational, which was unusual for private schools, and it was about experimenting, about thinking, and it was also this kind of experiment of people in a non-racial environment that would be the leaders of a future South Africa, where the kind of funders were looking towards how that would shift. And at that school, I was lucky enough to go to art, to do art for matric. And the art teacher, David Payton, took us to the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And I was really taken by this image, this painting in oil by Penny Siopis that I saw at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And this is, again, exposure, right? It's a privilege to see this. And the work is called Patience on a Monument. And Patience is sitting on this detritus of apartheid and colonialism. And she's peeling a lemon, this bitter fruit. And here we are, before the unbanning of the ANC and the release of Mandela, and what I'm, I was immediately drawn to the power of representation, the power of art to transform, and that sort of added to my kind of understanding of the city, the understanding of my place in the city, and I also. So I ended up going to art school at Wits. But I realized even at art school that I was different from my colleagues who were from the suburbs and had a much more cloistered life, while I, would have taken public transport and gone to the city from an Indian township and gone to some place like the Kinney Center, which would have been a gray area where people of color could go to the cinema. So the cinema story comes back to it. And so I was with the city. The city was something that didn't scare me, and so I oscillated again between suburb and city, small town and big city. And I show another image of 1970s Johannesburg, where younger me would come with my parents to Hillbrow, and there was this, the glamour of this of records, music, lights of the city. So there was this understanding of the city, or a love for the city, or being in the city, that was very much part of me. At art school, more than the fine arts in a way, what was really interesting was the history of art department. And there were amazing people, and there was this whole kind of liberal thinking around art. There was this whole feminist critique on Western art, which was very, very interesting, because I was able to see these things, but see this very, very intense critique of it by people like Rhoda Rosen, Brenda Schmarman, and a whole host of other people. And Sue Williamson's book sort of also puts together this kind of resistance art. So again, this power of art to transform, and then the kind of more out there things like Duchamp, which Professor Dupel was an expert on. So this shifting of my idea of representation, of ideas, and ways of seeing. John Burgess, amazing book that opened my eyes to new things. So at art school, I was able to take the kind of suburban kids, and you can read suburban as in white kids, into the city, to the art supply shop, which they weren't keen on, didn't understand, but this became part of our ground in which we worked. And I'd done 2 years, and a good friend of mine who I was studying with, who later became a famous artist in Berlin, Candice Breitz, asked me to, if I would, she was very conceptual, and she asked me if I would paint Monet's Haystack, and she would include it in her work. So she was doing this conceptual work about authorship, but I took this the very wrong way, because I sort of realized that I wasn't conceptual as an artist. I didn't have the kind of ego at the time to be an artist, or confidence. And the work I was doing was very, very retro, and it was impressionist, and it wasn't her intention. And so I gave up fine arts and moved to, I was in this quandary, and I sort of didn't know what I wanted to do, but I felt I needed to do something that made a meaningful difference in people's lives, that helped to repair the kind of experience of apartheid, the segregation that I saw around me. And so I went to Wits Architecture School, UC Johannesburg building, and it was so my life was actually quite charmed until this moment. I think it was the first time I realized what conservative was. The architecture school was incredibly patriarchal. It was a white space. It was very conservative for me, who'd been to this kind of radical high school. I'd been to art school, and I came to this space that was problematic, and I have to say, disliked it immensely for my undergraduate year. So that's to all people in the undergraduate year who are struggling. But it was a very different space, and that's why I teach today, so that I can make it different experience for people and find different kinds of experiences to that. And so it's as an example, just to set you in the era, this is a time that Mandela has been released, he's wearing suits, and he's negotiating our future. And he comes to Wits University one day, and Sushma and I, Sushma's a colleague of mine, just start screaming like Beatle fangirls, and so excited to see him, this icon of liberation and this change that's happening. And one of the students is quite derogatory openly in the class, and that sort of gives you the atmosphere of what I was, of where I was at the time. And things changed for me during an internship. So lecturer Hannah, who was, a bright light in this time, suggested I applied Mohammed Mayed Architects, and it was incredible. So his office used to be in this building with a barber shop next door, and it was the barber who used to feed the pigeons that later became known as Pigeon Square. So if you know the city, this is in Marshalltown. And I worked here for over a year, and it was life-changing. I mean, like I would advise anyone, any head of school to ask Mohammed Mayed to do a course on Islamic architecture and the kind of principles and the order of this, and working. I didn't work on Kirk Street Mosque, just on small details of it, but being in that space and other mosque projects with this very modern reading of traditional Islamic architecture was kind of a shift, a major turning point in my life, in my career, my sense of space and what architecture could do. And at the end of that, Mohammed was kind enough to give me a bonus. I think he did it for all his staff, on condition that you use your bonus on a flight to travel. And so I did this whole Islamic tour of Islamic architecture. So I went to Morocco, and I went to Cordoba, Granada in Spain, Istanbul, well, not everywhere, but those three countries. And I found in Fez an incredible awakening of architecture, of the urban aspect of architecture in it, and these kind of relationships between these things. And it was something that sort of changed. I was a weak student, and my report for my year out was like one of the first moments that shifted, that I could have a voice in this field. And so it comes very late in the day of struggling as an undergraduate student. And in my thesis year, I knew immediately, I knew before even doing my thesis what my thesis was going to be, and it was about spatial restitution. And my interest was and it was a time that was, very early post-apartheid South Africa. So no one was actually looking or talking through these things spatially. So it was cutting edge in that sense. But it was looking at my hometown through community interviews and segregation of the small town, and my grandfather's house, which is where I grew, very young child, behind the shop of my grandfather's house, which was forcibly removed. And this isn't this interest in palimpsest and layers, and even my thesis document, I was quite clear, was not going to look like other documents. It was fabric, and it was questioning the conventional senses of beauty or taste in architecture, and it used kind of feminine techniques. So if you want to talk about them like embroidery into the work, so it was looking at an alternative way of making, reading, and understanding these things, and then these are sort of these images. So it was kind of going back into seeing this loss that was my loss directly, but this loss in terms of the greater thing of the country, the amount we lost through racist processes that disrupted and erased narratives and created this kind of condition where I found myself identifying more on the margin and seeing the power of the margin and seeing the power of the margin as the space where difference is negotiated. And that sort of kind of comes to Homi Bhabha, who I read at the time and still read, this amazing book, which helps me kind of place myself in many ways. And so from that, I won the Corabrick Award, and then nationally I came second, and there was good prize money, and the rand was strong. And I traveled to different schools in the US to kind of like shop around for postgraduate, which Ian Lowe, my thesis supervisor at the time, was pushing towards. And I was really struck by this landscape urbanism course that had started, and I went to London and did this master's in landscape urbanism in one of its very founding years. So it was a very interesting space. Moisen Mustafavi's kind of was head of school, and this was his key kind of contribution to that. And at the end of the sort of London stage, it was a small group of us. We were 12, and about 7 of us were really good friends. And one night at Bar Italia over coffee, we formed this idea of Office 247 architecture. So it was this idea that we were all from different places, and someone is awake at some point, and we could enter competitions, and we did enter a few competitions like this before the internet and the systems that we have today. It was a much more difficult kind of process, but Rose was in Melbourne, Jose was in San Diego, Griffin was in Singapore, and Armando was in Mexico City. So someone was awake all the time, and today most of the Office 247s haven't survived, but there is the office in Mexico City. So Armando's office is called Office 247, and so is mine. But then I come back to South Africa, and it's kind of like what to do, and I have a dinner immediately. Sort of first week I'm back with my friend Sue, and Sue is dating a guy called Ian, who's working for Mushubani Rose, and I'm trying to show this notion of network, which is so important for an architect, and it's so unspoken often because it's about how good or big your network is that defines how good how big your practice is, or what your influence is, or what your connectivities are. And so what happened was Ian said they were working at Origin Center with Jeremy Rose, and there's an exhibit architect, Nina Cohen, and I would get along very well with her, and he was going to introduce me. And so he introduces me to Hilton and Nina, and we hit it off. There's a synergy, and I end up working sort of not for them, but with them in a strange relationship that Nina, carved out jobs for me to do rather than supervise me, which was great, which added to my kind of independence. And so I worked in town again. in the Diamond District at their office. And I ended up working on Origins, but we got fired on the exhibition design there. 20 years later, I would go back to fix the exhibit. And I worked in Constitution Hill, which became a real passion of mine, and on Angus and Fiona's house, which is this incredible project in which I sort of cut my teeth, because I did the technical some of the design development and the technical drawings, and worked on site on this incredible house, conceptualized by Nina, who's an incredible architect and was a real great influence. And so Nina sort of the next sort of step in my growth as an architect, and connecting me to these kind of things of making in architecture, and then also a passion for things like Constitution Hill, which led to kind of a project in Kliptown, and just also the technical thing of making something, and taking a concept through development. So Nina sort of has a sabbatical, she has a baby and leaves me holding this baby. And I take on being the consultant on Constitution Hill, which I'm going to get back to. But there's another project which she didn't want to take on for whatever reason. And it was the house for Stephen, and he had a great art collection, and he wanted something in his house that would change that. And a young architect, sort of on my own, does this Tadeo Ando-esque off-shutter concrete job with a bucky builder that Stephen, the client, insisted that we use, who was wonderful, and we built this this beautiful sort of entry into a Barney Britt's house, which is a donut-shaped house, and we sort of reconfigured that entrance as a thing that is this art gallery into his space, and a study and a bathroom space. And that leads to a series of houses that I ended up doing through referrals, to friends referring. So the network again, which I've never been actually good at, but this at Dwight and Annie's house, which my friend Nick recommended me for, and then this kind of spiral staircase, and this heritage house that I started to create a language about how to interpret, work inside those projects. And I'm not going to show the houses. I'm going to jump into Constitution Hill, which became a real passion for me. I was there from the early days, before the court was built, and during that kind of process of business planning. I was on the heritage education tourism team, and that also created this understanding of collaboration of different ideas, different people, and I watched this grow, and I worked on it on multiple levels, from signage to other sorts of things. But my real passion was in this kind of archival history that has an implication on design decisions, on what do we keep, what don't we keep, what do things mean, how do we tell stories, how do we tell these stories of Black histories, which are so Black and oppression stories that are so not visible, especially in Joburg, where there's little heritage buildings as such. And here was this public site that had this mandate to tell these stories. And so that becomes a real thing that I grapple with, that still interests me today, and that I'm still involved at Constitution Hill today. I taught a course 2 years ago at Wits again, where we looked at Constitution Hill and trying to sort of mend problems, things that didn't work, and this tying of things, which Liam's project here shows, this kind of connection between the two areas around it. And then a very interesting project by Victor Georgiev, a student of mine, who looked at LGBTQI marginalized histories of Constitution Hill, and he sort of reimagines this area. Like Hillbrow would have had this kind of history of nightlife, and on Hill has these kind of histories, and he reimagines Constitution Hill and this area through a queer lens, and by looking at desktop research, archival desktop research on photographs that he finds from the area and newspaper clippings. And he maps those out into creating this map, queer map of the area that is about reimagining the space. And that's what I mean by these words. I think the bio that Mark read out is, there are these kind of words, and what I'm trying to unpack today in this presentation are those those kind of words and what do they mean. And so, 20 years on from my first stepping out at Con Hill, I was involved in a conference which Hilton Juden had set up, and I presented this paper, which is now in this book, which looks at this 20-year period of my reading of heritage and what is erased and what is not erased, and how we deal with these kinds of heritage in Constitution Hill. And I'm also designing, it's been a long period, an exhibition, the Museum of the Constitution, which looks at our Constitution and is in a new space in Constitution Hill, designed by MRA. So that sort of gives you a sense of just my interest in this idea of sort of cartography, archive, forensics, and it sort of explains, which I've been trying to explain to Fiona, who I teach with, what design research means. And there's a shift to kind of commercial practice and this idea of design research, where ideas or things that you unpack have meaning to your practice. And so I'm looking at a milestone year, which is in 2010, which actually starts off in a very low point. It starts off with me being at home because I've given up my office. There were no projects, and I watched the Soccer World Cup. And I'm not a soccer fan. In fact, I haven't watched since, but I watched it religiously. And somewhere along one of these games, I got a phone call about a project in Parktown. A friend, actually my ex art teacher, Clive Vandenberg, and colleague, suggested, he was neighbors, that they contact me, and they had bought a Herbert Baker house, the clients, and they wanted to change that. They wanted to add an office to this Herbert Baker house, and so it was this beautiful project again for me to kind of scratch through history and understand it and question what does a staff room mean for a 100-year-old house, and the kind of culture that meant, and how can we reconfigure that. And so I look at this old staff area and we reconfigure it into an apartment downstairs and a guest bedroom and an office for the client, which is this glass box that then becomes quite iconic and is a milestone in that published. Well, I've been published before, but because it's so formally striking, it had this kind of image. It won a lot of awards. It was published widely, and it had this kind of James Bond moment where it sort of overlooked the ridge. And then this would have been a highlight where the citation from the GIFA Awards, it won a SCI award as well, but the citation meant a lot because it came from Jeremy Rose, who was an architect I looked up to, and so his words of my work was a moment of great success. But as an architect, you have, or I have had, more failures than successes. I've entered many competitions, but I've had to take failure as you would in science, as a laboratory, as this is an experiment that proves unsuccessful rather than a failure. And the one project that I'm most miffed about was the Commonwealth War Memorial, which is problematic in its kind of inception, being this kind of colonial structure, wanting to sort of whitewash their sins. But I thought our project was very interesting in that it gave them a way out. It offered something, and this is in Company Gardens in Cape Town. It offered a way that a memorial can be a social space. It can be a landscape urban project. It was about folding the landscape to allow more to happen. And it was taking the space under the trees and kept these trees as a space of dialogue, and where these kind of issues, broader issues of colonial oppression could be unpacked. And these are some of the renders and these ideas which show in these kind of diagrams around the folding ground, or a play between the exterior skin, which would be where the names are engraved, and the interior skin, which is the seated area, which is allowing for dialogue, while the outside allows for memorialization. And also, by having this duality, it made the sort of mandate, it made the voice of the monument much larger, because I found it problematic that they were just trying to name the Black South Africans who hadn't been named before for their participation in World War I. But really, the bigger issue was that these South Africans, Black South Africans, had little choice, maybe, and where they did have choice, there was an expectation that they would then be, given full citizenship as Black South Africans in this, and that assault it's much larger than not having your name inscribed, because it would change history. If at that point there had been shifts, and there were calls for this. There was opportunity for the colonial regime to make amends and to shift its policies, and that's a model just showing that kind of space. And this then comes to kind of a triangle that I wrestle with all the time. I'm hyper self-critical and suffer great self-doubt, but also have to have self-belief, otherwise I wouldn't do anything. And I think for me, if there's any sort of clue or any sort of advice I can give, it's about keeping this in balance. Because sometimes if the self-belief is too high, the work is also too thin, because you're not being critical about it enough. And doubt is really an important thing, because it keeps you on your toes. And so these three images just show what's on my phone. I have thousands of them. When I take photographs, and I'm a bad photographer, it snags. All I see is snags. So it's been interesting putting together this set of work for you today. So I'm going to, I have a lot of slides, and I'm going to go through them quite quickly, because we've done a lot of work in the 22 years. And but really, the ones I'm going to show you now about rethinking museum, and that museums need to be rethought as we build our stories, and how to disrupt, reinvent, and reimagine museums. And it starts off with me with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, where I did an exhibit called Prisoner in the Garden, which was published by Penguin as a book that was all about the unpacking of the archive. And you see the white stones, and that represented the quarry. And that was, what affected Mandela's cataracts, and that's why he's wearing sunglasses in that image. With the Daily Mail, the British Daily Mail at the time when they came to inspect. And it's this idea of bringing that in, making the exhibition stronger, have this kind of materiality. And that started a relationship. Kind of Mark's question, how does work happen? From that exhibition, I ended up doing the entire renovation of the NMF into the Center for Dialogue. So when Mandela stopped using it as his office when he retired, then the space became much more public as an archive and exhibition space. And then recently we've done a bookshop for them, which is this kind of hovering structure behind that glass wall. And yeah, I'm going to speed up on a moral and cultural precinct. I've spoken about it before, but this is in the Northwest Province, and was a very interesting project for me, where heritage, landscape, mapping all come together. And it was about putting together this landscape where we took a nearby settlement pattern, Swana settlement pattern from Pilanesberg, Pilani City, and from understanding it, so working with Francois Coetzee from UNISA, took a portion of that and overlaid it onto the site of colonial buildings, which was a school and a church, or two churches. And this was about reconfiguring this ground. And this is what I'm showing here in terms of the process that it took to build this landscape and to renovate these buildings into this new dialogue, which is what my practice, what my thinking was all about, with these new dialogues that are shifting the ground. And yeah, we literally shift the ground. We really literally remake the ground into this indigenous landscape with these settlement patterns that then start to become something that you can engage with on multiple levels, from events, funerals, weddings that happen here, to this landscape that is about a repair. It's about returning back to its indigeneity, and still keeping these colonial buildings very strongly identified in their histories and unpacked in exhibitions that happen inside of them. And again, my kind of interest in the archival, looking at what was there before and how the process that comes through, and rebuilding that as one of my layers, the layer of the missionary, and reconstructing that and unpacking it. And these just show sort of moves between sort of the past and then the renovation. And these kind of ideas, the dark brown brick meant new structures, new bathrooms, new facilities for this rural area that needed these things. In fact, was a big part of making the site usable, were these kind of service buildings, that these skinny service buildings that, sorry, the slides are moving a bit slowly. That sort of unpack insertions into this thing, so which is the last sort of layer of the site of Morolane. I'm going to try and move quickly because time is moving on. But so these are harpo patterns. It's one cultural practice of decorating homes, and what we see over here. And so we use this in this structure. So in the latter that make this, and in the shadow that happens, and then in the wallpaper inside the museum, and then in this 3D constructed wall that is made out of CNC cut timber to create these things. So it's this kind of thing of tradition and modernity colliding, which was very much our brief. And then in the exhibition, we changed the format of what is the museum format, in talking about mythologies, in talking about cultural practices that are different from a Western idiom. And so we find languages to talk to those different idioms of exhibition and representation. And then I'm jumping on to another project, which is Maropeng, which is the Cradle of Humankind, and Experienced Lab, which has been a very successful project for me in this kind of thing of museums. And it's about how one deals with information and experiences information. And this project was about creating a cave. So we took images from Sterkfontein Cave, and then we traced over them. And sorry, this is some stats into the space, which was again this kind of computer-aided production process that we use in creating this entirely plywood and 3D printed exhibition that recreates a cave in which children can play and explore, and the information embedded within it. So again, this relationship of the body and the exhibit is completely shifted. The ground is literally, the ground beneath your feet is literally not level anymore. It is a landscape in which you explore, and the walls become this artifice of landscape, this architectural landscape. And so it's this completely immersive experience where there's kind of an edutainment level to it, but it's about exploration rather than the idea of the museum or the Western Museum or the Colonial Museum that I grew up with. This I just showed for Craig's benefit. This was the MRA building at Origins, which houses artwork collection, and our proposal, which won, was to show everything, to show the archive, because the rock engravings have very little academic work done on them. So it's not completely understood what they mean, and they're quite disjunctured because they come from all over and they were collected in an unsavory manner. And so the project takes the entire collection, and so it's an archive in which students, because it's on campus, can look at the entire archive and unpack it and do the work that still needs to be done in understanding the collection. This is a quick little one which traveled. It's the past and looks at this idea of South Africa being this incredible cornerstone of the cradle of humankind with our fossil hominid finds, with great scientific research in DNA and this notion that we all come from Africa that is proven through DNA and through the fossil finds, plus our kind of history of race and segregation and apartheid, makes for this messaging that we're actually all from one, and race is this construct, this colonial construct that was economically beneficial rather than actually about human beings. And this just shows this idea of creative imagination. How can we make something that is spatial, that is sculptural, that is allowing engagement, that is beyond the kind of usual museum experiences. I'm going to have to move through this one quite fast. This is a student project that we did. We went to Kimberley and looked at Malay Camp. With students, we went into the archive and found things and interviewed people, and that's me and my student group in front of Salt Like's monument, and finding this document, which was an objection by the Muslim community to the Salt Lake University building that was going to happen on the site of forced removals. And this inspired a project that we did with Lemon Pebble Architects and was part of our participation at last year's Architectural Biennale for Leslie Loco. And this explored this, in terms of making, explored this idea of drawing, which we as architects do. We draw. So it took this idea of redrawing the lost buildings. And here you see me tracing in CAD and then redrawing these things in Revit so that they became these kind of beads, tracing over the kind of photocopied images that we had of the mosques that were demolished as part of the forced removals by order of De Beers Mining Company. And this is the project at Venice, which was well received and has a whole projection and audio component to it with a huge team involved. And then we were then part of this year's Biennale, Art Biennale, which was exciting. And we did the technical design and exhibition design for Made You Look, Nare and Molemo, and the arts Nara and Molemo, and these are some of the renders we did for them, which was this landscape they wanted to create. So the landscape comes through again, but they had done something similar at Documenta, and we gave it a little bit of a shift in how it could work and how it could make it, and there was the challenge of making something in Venice from South Africa, and that could be unpacked and made quite quickly because of labor costs and so forth. And so we came up with this flat pack system, which the entire thing, was installed in 2 days. And the bigger issue was carrying it, and you see some models, physical and digital, and photographs of the process of building this landscape, and then some of the final images. Obviously, this doesn't give you the full sense of the artwork, which has a whole sound piece I made you look. And then I want to end with something that we've just completed, which is the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Witwatersrand, and it's the Teaching and Resource Center. And again, for me, a big part of it was understanding the politic, understanding the university's history, its exclusionary history, where medical students weren't allowed Black medical students weren't allowed initially, and then they were in small numbers, and kind of racist histories of that. And also post Fees Must Fall, the clients kind of need to make it an entirely student-oriented building. And this building is very much student-oriented. It's on the roof of an existing brutalist apartheid building. And it seeks to be the opposite. It seeks to be light. It seeks to be friendly. It seeks to be dialogue space. It seeks to enhance light and the courtyard space. And it has a very strong diagrammatic kind of formation, which helps set this conceptual clarity, which I enjoy in the way you circulate, and the way things are set through, and the way services are set through. And the building is flexible. It has all these moving walls, which allows the core space at the top to become one big exam venue, or different kind of configurations of space. And ultimately creates an entry point and a framing device, a courtyard into the campus, and it extends space. It extends leisure space, leisure study space, and it sort of is a nod towards this idea that so much of learning happens outside of the classroom. It happens with your colleagues in these kind of sitting outside with this incredible view of Joburg skyline, but chatting to friends about your work, about your studies. And everything about it, even the stairs, encourage this idea of social experience. And then I'm just showing a clip here, which might take a while to set up on your side. There it is. And Mark had asked me to just, unpack what it takes to make a building. We often see the shot in the magazine, but it takes a lot. It takes 2 years of construction in this case. It's entirely steel building because the roof could not hold the weight of concrete. And so it is this very unusual building in its materiality that unpacks into creating spaces that are extremely student-friendly, that are about lightness, about view, natural ventilation, safety, and this is a study room that we create that elevates this notion of the student and the study, the space of studying and the space of collective studying across a table, which, because the building is raised, every table in this building is powered, has a power source. And we also did these phantom heads for the dental school in the same building, which is also about, showing the kind of guts of the building. And then these are the very large classrooms we designed to allow for large undergraduate classrooms, which is all about this kind of transformation of education and the gateway of tertiary education into transformation of South Africa. And this the sort of last image, which just shows the quality of light and this lightness, the striving for lightness in architecture, and meaningfulness in architecture. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nabeel. Another extraordinary lecture. I think Craig's talk last week filled us with delight, and you've matched that experience really beautiful work, and I'm not familiar with all of your work. And it's been really so valuable to see the arc of the work and to hear you talk in such a insightful and thoughtful way about the production of the work. Thank you. So at this point, we open the floor and invite people to share any reflections they might have had on what they have seen, or if they have any comments on what they've seen, or if they have any questions. And I see that Craig has posted a question that I'm just going to read it out. He's asked me to read it out for him because he has something that he has to attend to, although he's been with us for the whole talk. And Craig says, "Thank you for this fantastic talk, Nabeel. I'm sorry I couldn't stay any longer, but I do have a question, and Mark has kindly offered to ask it on my behalf. For the benefit of our students, there is consistent evidence of a razor-sharp, contextual insight, deep-rooted sensitivity, criticality, and honesty in your work, your words and your ability to interpret the work of others. Could you discuss the relationship and perhaps the balance between your practice and teaching of architecture, particularly in respect of three recurring preoccupations: cartography, archive, and heritage, and how this might have evolved over time?" I know that's quite a big question. So could you discuss the relationship and perhaps the balance between your practice and teaching of architecture in respect of three preoccupations: cartography, archive, and heritage, and how this has evolved over time? Maybe you could try and respond to that and share your reflections on that, Nabeel.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Craig, for the lovely words. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I watched Craig's presentation, and there are similarities between us. Obviously, similarities. Craig, to teach, I think a lot of this is not ad hoc, but it's a process, and not predetermined by me in many ways. So I'm constantly in doubt, constantly evolving, constantly rethinking these things. And why I enjoy the teaching at Wits is that it's a short semester in which I'm able to produce the kind of question, the framework, and so I've been cheeky at times. So when we lost, we were shortlisted but lost the project for the graduation hall in Kimberley, I had such sour grapes that I decided that we would do the project on that site and unpack it and look at its history and unravel everything, because I was just, sour grapes turning to sweet wine or something kind of idea. And those interests are not, they're explored in bits in a way. My bigger interest, those are tools in a way for me. My bigger interest is in understanding how through time things have changed, and how we so often ignore them, or we don't want to deal with the past, but sometimes the past is just this burden. And for me, my interest is in how the past is something that we need to confront in order to go forward. And that's the real interest. The cartography, or looking at heritage, or teaching or making, all of this for me is about moving us forward, moving my projects forward in terms of that conversation and that dialogue of how can we find our own lexicon, how can we move to finding our own identities beyond our past, but for me it is in the past that those questions can be answered.
Thank you for that, Nabeel. That was a good question and a lovely response. And I see that Notando has her hand up and has a question for you. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Notando.
Hi, Nabeel. How are you?
Natanga.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was quite delightful to actually hear you speak about it because I do know a bit of your work. And also like listening to you reflect on what it means to be a practitioner in the different facets. I think you have like slightly answered my question in your previous answer, but I'll pose it either way. So I'm personally interested in thinking of architecture as an archival practice, but for me, just listening to your presentation, what was most evident in your work is that keeping alive of the archive. So not in the sense of just using that material as archival material and creating another archive, but rather creating futures for that archive as well to sit in conversation with the present, the past, and the future. So what I wanted to know is how do you imagine how do you frame the archive within your own practice, and how do you decide on methods? Because I think from the presentation I just saw a multitude of methods, and sometimes we struggle with methodology in practice. And what I saw is the encouragement of like it's okay to use more than one method. So I just want to know how the archive sits within your own practice, and how do you decide on methods?
Thank you very much. It's interesting. So that very early project at Nelson Mandela Foundation was actually, I got to literally build their archive to kind of archival standards. And a very interesting group of people that were developing that. And ultimately, and it is an incredible archive, the Nelson Mandela Foundation one, because not because of the building, but because of the archivist and kind of collections that they have put together. And often the question is, so much gets erased, so much gets lost when it's not part of the hegemony, it's not part of the narrative. And often we are we're scratching the surface for material culture, for evidence of things. And the colonial and apartheid systems were very good in archiving, and it's about turning those bits of information on its head, and unpacking those kinds of things. So like at the Commonwealth War Memorial, they had all the information of all the names, all the people, the Black South Africans who participated in the war. They just never wanted to acknowledge that. So those archives are there, and it's about one institutions that can build them and start to do that, and there are a multitude of smaller archives across South Africa, and we have our national archive, which is kind of like overburdened, which sits in Pretoria. But these smaller sort of, I'll call them struggle archives, are very, very interesting spaces in which I think there's so much to unpack. And my interest is in unpacking them not just as a narrative, as a book, but that they become unpacked and they become real and they become spatial. And they become experienced, if that helps. But I think it's wonderful that there is an interest to look back and to look at the archive and to find these things and to find them critically and to make something new out of them, because it's so very easy to just forget and move on, which would suit some narratives. And I feel to heal, to repair, we need to unpack those histories and understand them. And that's why even in my story, I talk about my experiences through spaces of privilege and spaces of segregation and taking public transport or going to the cinema, because that's very much important of the way I see the world, the way I see South Africa, and the way I want my students to, and sometimes with the students that are born frees, as we call them, and don't often speak to their parents and grandparents and understand these histories. And I think it's important because those structures are still with us today, those structures of subjugation, of oppression, of in our spatialities every day. And we need to be able to recognize them and break them.
I don't know how to feel because I'm also born free, but thank you.
Thanks for your question, Notando, and thanks for your response to that, Nabeel. Somebody has their hand up. Fatu, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fatu has a hand up. If you would like to pose your question to Nabeel.
It's Patu, by the way. Hi, Nabeel. I just wanted to ask a question about the Wits project, the one at medical school. So I liked how you got into it. Like fun fact, I was there today. I have a friend at medical school. So I was waiting for her at the courtyard. And I noticed how the flow of the space is kind of awkward in front of that pond. And there's like this planter. And I thought if you could just cut a diagonal path to the main entrance, to the existing main entrance, is there a reason why the practice didn't do that? And yeah, that's the question.
Pastor, thank you for joining. So just to say, part is a student of mine from earlier this year and did an incredible project on SAN knowledge systems. Part two, that's part of phase B. There's a whole waterproofing project. So even that ground floor is on a roof of the building. So it's 4th floor, and there is the project to reconfigure that ground floor to be more friendly, but they need to sort out the waterproofing first. So it'll be part of that whole waterproofing project that will happen probably this year, and I'm not sure whether we would do it because of the way procurement works. But yeah, I hear you completely. But I think the interesting thing of our project is that it adds a whole lot of channels of energy through the staircases, which were the fire escape staircases that we sort of celebrate. And we created this idea that make the fire escapes on the outside so that you can use them. You know, they become daily use, and they add connectivity to this new building, which is all about students. You know, we even designed a little kitchenette because at medical school you have one service provider for food and it's expensive and awful, and so we did microwave and a wash-up place for students so that you can bring your 2-minute noodles and you know, study all night because it's a 24-hour space. So yeah, thank you for the question, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to commend you on the way you've changed my perspective on looking at spaces and digging deeper into the layers. Like, I really see myself, like, with the project we even have now, I want to know what was there before. I don't know, like, I'm just fascinated by history, but I think the elective choice I chose was the right one, and it's just a nice thing to know what's deeper, what's beneath that we do not see. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I hope your project becomes a thesis next year.
I will. I will.
Thanks for your question, Patu, and your response. I don't know if there are any other questions. If anybody has any questions they'd like to pose to Nabeel, or if you have a comment or something you'd like to share, please. Yeah, I can see Obakeng. Obakeng, please go ahead and ask Nabeel the question you have here.
Yes, you mentioned the Moruleng. I think you said it was a cultural precinct where you overlaid essentially like this these kind of indigenous like living kind of systems over like this that space there. So what in the process of doing that, what kind of things you begin to uncover about both you could say, I guess maybe the more, what's the word? Sorry, I can't remember words right now. What do you really like start to uncover from overlaying these two different kind of ways to look at the landscape with these things?
Thanks, Obakeng. Thank you for attending. Thanks for the question. I went through that a little bit quickly. It's quite a dense kind of project. So the church and the school were on 2 different sites, and part of our project, part of our idea to the client was to consolidate them into one bigger precinct, which became a cultural precinct. And since those two buildings were so colonial and they were part of the missionary, which had a positive and negative history with the Bafokeng people, positive in that it helped them buy the land, negative in that Christianity, in many ways, erased a lot of indigenous belief systems and knowledge systems, and there were some horrendous histories at the time. But ultimately, what and with the project for the tribal authority, and what our brief was to understand the Bakatla in a way that went pre-colonial and looked into the future. So it wasn't this kind of cultural museum that is usually kind of within the Western gaze as this kind of backward or system that lived in huts or that kind of thing. We were looking at the city of Pilani, which was an incredible infrastructure, and that is a few kilometers away, and is a reason for a land claim. And we took that data and that information and overlaid it onto this site to really mess things up, to say, you know, we need to mess this order so that we can question the orders in here. And so it creates this whole kind of playful space in which, you know, weddings and things happen in, and that you explore the landscape. But it also means that that symmetry, that axiality between buildings is gone, and that this kind of rural and connectivities and spatialities between things is now organized by a pre-colonial, sophisticated, urban organizational system. And so some of the things we you know, there's the khotla, there's the kraal, there is the midden in which the cows came and the importance of cows. And all of those stories become real in this thing. And you can take a child and explain that through them or walk them through these things. And so it's in some ways a kind of Disneyfication. It's taking something from history and reconstructing it. But by doing it through these layers, it kind of makes, and those layers are very distinct. It makes you understand those layers, which kind of Patu was talking about, in a way that time freezes over layers in this palimpsest where some things emerge and some things don't, and gives you a complexity of understanding both the landscape and its history.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I just hopped on when you were like halfway through, so I wanted to kind of get the gist of what the project was about. But thank you.
Thanks, Obakeng.
Thank you, Obakeng. And we have a couple more hands up. I saw Joanne had her hand up, but seems to not be there anymore. But Sinte has a hand up. Perhaps you'd like to ask your question?
I have been waiting. I thought my Wi-Fi is going to go off before you get to me. But I'd like to begin by saying that I'm amazed by your work and how I think it stretches across all the way from rural to urban, and it looks really beautiful. I think the only thing that I'm struggling with is when it came to how you spoke of your project in, I can't quite remember, but it was before the Maporeng project, the Cradle of Africa project, and you spoke of creating service buildings in the rural area. And my question is, in that area, how do you trace, let's say, the impermanent part of their history? So if they happen to have had a building method that is not necessarily something that you would be able to see today, how would you retrace that and sort of like document it and use that to inform how you go on to design for the space to capture their identity in the new space?
Sanjay, thank you. Yeah, great question. Again, I went through these projects very quickly, so there was a lot about intangible history. And there's a lot within South African histories that are intangible, or there is no material evidence or material cultures of them. And so this is this reimagining that I talk about. But within the museum space, there is multiple interviews with elderly people translating this oral tradition of stories, which are great, you know, and they're seen very much as the grandchild, this intergenerational thing, that the grandchild versus the grandmother, and those kind of stories that are getting lost, and the museum becomes the vessel for that, and we were very aware both of oral histories and artisanal skills and ways of making that were being lost. And so there were a series of projects, from the construction of stonework, which is an elderly retired man who had taken it on himself to do this in his rural town nearby. And then we, through sort of research, found him, and he managed this entire reconstruction process of the rock work. And we found people who could still make clay buildings, and a group of women, in fact, who did clay pots and built the cephalana, which we construct as this vessel, which would have been, you know, the cephalana was the vessel which the chief kept where grain was stored for time of drought. It was like a tax, and you gave your grain, and then in time of drought you had something to sustain on. And all of these processes were built into this very large project with multiple players in it, and like an entire board of Bachatla people who were advisory on what we did, and their roles in playing their stories and their roles, both in tradition and in culture, and we were very aware that we weren't Bachatla as a team. We had seconded a young person from the community who became our kind of intermediary in this voice, and we had a local builder and so forth. So there was a huge amount of local participation in coming into the stories, but we were just the vehicle in order to form those stories. We had the skills to help those stories form, rather than being directed in choosing or making those stories. If that helps. And it's a very subtle and very difficult thing to traverse.
I saw that Joanne Fredericks had her hand up earlier, but she's put a question in the chat, so I'll read it out. Unless, John, you would like to ask the question directly, I can read it out. So Joanne says, I greatly enjoyed your exploration of Johannesburg architecture, particularly your focus on identity and middle spaces. My question relates to my work in the Unit 28. That's the unit at the GSA headed by Mkolisi Makubo, working with Thandeka Mnguni, to my work on Unit 28 located in Yeoville. How do you approach dealing with buildings that have a deep history and inform the community's identity, ensuring that any alterations are sensitive and respectful to their historical significance? I'll just read that again. How do you approach dealing with buildings that have a deep history and inform the community's identity, ensuring that any alterations are sensitive and respectful to their historical significance?
So there's a very quick answer to that, is whose historical significance? What is historically significant to the building? And so you need to ask that question, because often we say that, you know, it's these columns or it's these arches, or is it that this is a space in which certain activities took place, you know, or are these certain kinds of memories, or is the staff quarters, because it's not so architecturally beautiful or profound or impactful, is that less significant? And so I'm always asking the question, whose significance and what is significant? And that's the first point for me, is what significance are we preserving in these historic buildings? And which was that Kleine kind of project, because we looked at the staff quarters, and remodeled that as a thing that still kept its memory. So yeah, and it's a hard one because heritage tends to be a conservative practice in all countries, really, because it's about preservation of the past, and often that preservation of the past is a preservation of a politic of the past, of a heyday, of whiteness, of colonialism, of segregation, of privilege. And so we have to ask those questions.
Thanks for that, Nabeel. I'm just going to read out a few of the comments that are in the chat. Lots of lovely plaudits. Thank you, Nabeel. Daniel Burton says, thank you, Nabeel. Really enjoy your process and design thinking. Yako Devet said, Nabeel, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your works. I'm amazed at the humble person you are and the amazing designs you have accomplished. What an example to us all and the young architects of the future. And then we have Khaleesi Makubo from the GSA. Great presentation, Nabeel. I love the archival images at the beginning of your talk. It contextualized your work beautifully. Well done on an amazing career. Ron Duran says, thank you, Nabeel. Impressive. Lone Paulson, who's an external examiner at the GSA and also lectured at WIT, says, it's been extraordinary to watch your architectural journey from your studies at WITS to today. This is really important and relevant work, both for practice and teaching. Thank you for archiving it and sharing it with us. I think that's a nice point for us to close. And thank you, Nabeel. I mean, I think it's been a really, really fascinating evening. It's been wonderful seeing the work and really wonderful hearing your voice and your narrative and you're talking over it. I know you did that spontaneously, and it was really very powerful presentation. I think that we're all really grateful for. So thank you so much for sharing your work, and thanks for all the work that you continue to do with your teaching practice as well as your practice as a practicing architect. Thank you. Just a reminder that for those of you who do want to get CPDs, I know there's been a chain of commentary in the chat. You can get the details in the chat as to how you can do that. But on that point, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, for attending. We also had a very significant turnout as we did last week. I'm glad to see that these talks and these lectures are impactful and reaching people. And Nabeel, thank you so much for sharing your work and putting together what was a really compelling, fascinating presentation, really insightful, I think providing a lot of really interesting perspectives, strategies and approaches on how one practices in such a complex and contested place, and how you are able to achieve such poetry and lyricism in your work. Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. Thank you.